Hi, everybody, and welcome to part three. In this part, I want to look at two examples of the ways in which sexuality changes and transforms as the world around sexuality, the world within which sexuality happens, also goes through a lot of changes. And I'm going to focus on the identity aspect of sexuality, those identities, those categories that are available for individuals to claim or for individuals to take on the meaning of being a certain type of sexual person, identifying with a certain expression of sexuality. And we're going to look at two examples in Canada. One is same sex marriage, and the other is the very recent and still emerging identity of being asexual. Asexuality is an identity or something that you can be rather than a pathology or a lack of desire or a dysfunction or something like that. So here we go. So, same sex marriage, as I noted at the beginning of the lecture, the terminology that we have is a bit inadequate, particularly living in a world in which the idea of same and opposite sexes is brought into question, and where we have many people whose lived experience is not just within a binary of being the same sex as some people, but the opposite sex from this other group of people. Nonetheless, the language of the terminology of same sex marriage is what we have in law, and it's the terminology that's used when information and data is collected. So maybe this is a study in social change. Our words, our vocabulary is lagging behind the actual experiences that people are living with and the concepts and ideas that are meaningful to them. Nonetheless, we're going to stick with the somewhat antiquated terminology because it's what we've got. So, a brief history of same sex marriage in Canada. When I first started teaching gender at U of A, it was same sex marriage was illegal. And members of the clergy, there were some ministers, some priests who'd held same sex weddings and gotten themselves into legal trouble um, uh, for sort of like fake marriages, marrying people who couldn't possibly legally marry. Like, it was in the same category as marrying a brother and a sister, for instance. Um, and then fast forward a couple of decades, and now we have kids in high school who have never lived in a country in which two men can't get married or two women can't get married. So it's been a pretty major change. The timeline takes place over a few decades. In 2001, the first Canadian census, or, or rather, the 2001 census was the first in Canada to have a category for people in same sex couple relationships. Prior to that census, if there were two men living together in a partnership relationship or two women, according to the census, they were just roommates. There was no way to indicate that this was a same-sex intimate partnership. So a lot of people's sexual identity, their relationship with their partner, was just completely invisible to the census until 2001. 2005, Canada becomes the third country in the world after, I believe, it's Denmark and Sweden, to recognize that a man can marry a man and a woman can marry a woman, as well as a woman marrying a man. Um, the legal arguments for this came basically from three sources. One was the human rights argument, which held that defining marriage as between a man and a woman is it is in fact a form of discrimination on the basis of gender. And the way that that works is this: if person X is a woman and they want to marry person Y, who is also a woman, but they can't because the way marriage laws are written, it says, marriage is between a man and a woman. What that amounts to is discrimination on the basis of sex. If person X was a man and wanted to marry person Y, there'd be no problem. Person X is constrained. Their ability uh, to to do this thing they want to do, to marry this person, is denied to them on the basis of their sex. So it's one argument is this is kind of straight up sex discrimination. The Your ability to marry someone should not be constrained by your own sex, just like your ability to take a job or vote or drive a car should not be constrained by your sex category. A second argument had to do with social equality, and this was the idea that what Canada has been, or ideally should be, moving towards is a more equal, less stratified society, and a situation in which some people in Canada can publicly and officially recognize their partner relationships through marriage and the various benefits it confers, while a large group of other people can't do the same thing because of their sexuality, because of they are in a relationship with someone of the same sex. That runs counter to the overall drive for greater equality in Canada. So, in the interest of social equality for all Canadians, um, we should not have a sort of, in effect, two-tier system where heterosexuals can, if they choose, um, get married, or not if they choose not to. But homosexuals are denied that choice, do not have that choice. And the third argument was a sort of straightforward sociological argument that public attitudes, social attitudes about homosexuality and same sex relations had changed and evolved a lot over the last few decades, and laws need to change to keep up with the changes in what Canadians believe, what they value, what is important to them. So, these laws that were drafted back in the, in some cases, the 19th century are no longer adequate at the beginning of the 21st because um, society has moved on. And so we need to bring laws into conformity with reality. Um, so you put all those arguments together, and it's a pretty strong argument in favor of um, amending at the provincial level, because that's where marriages are sort of regulated and registered, amending legislation to remove any reference to the sexes or the genders of people getting married. This was not uncontroversial. You had controversy coming from the conservative side, from some religious groups who believed that allowing two men to marry or two women to marry um, sort of ran counter to the religious purpose of marriage, which was to procreate and beget a family, and also that allowing same-sex marriage would be harmful to the children of the people that were involved in the marriage, that having two mothers or two fathers was not natural, not the way that God intended it. There were also arguments, though, from the other side, from the left, from uh, queer rights advocates and activists who were worried about the rise of what they called homonormativity, which is the idea that what queer people, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and so forth, what they ought to aspire to is to be just like heterosexuals. So if a man can marry a woman, then a man should be able to marry a man, a woman should be able to marry a woman. And indeed, it is very important that a man be able to marry a man and a woman be able to marry a woman. The homonormativity argument or sort of concern about the importance of same-sex marriage was essentially that it still relies on this, think of Lillian Ruben's charm circle, of this kind of central idealized heteronormative heterosexual married couple as the ideal, to which everybody else with their diverse sexual identities and relationships and partnerships should be brought into conformity. So you had queer and gay rights activists saying, okay, same-sex marriage makes sense, but we do not want it to become held up as the ideal, or we do not really see the need to celebrate that now we can be just like straight people. So arguments, same-sex marriage was not uncontroversial. Here's how it played out in terms of people taking up the opportunity to marry a same-sex partner. These are the number of same-sex couple households by Canadian census year and marital status, married versus cohabiting, not married. So 2001, about 35,000 same-sex couple households. Remember, 2001 was the first year that same-sex couples had a place in the census. Everybody was cohabiting, nobody was married because you couldn't marry at that time. 5 years later, a year after same-sex marriage becomes legal in Canada, we see a significant jump in the number of same-sex couple households overall. And we also see that about 7,500 have, in that 1 year alone, gotten married. And as the census years roll on, we see not only rapid increases in the number of same-sex households, but we also see a growing proportion of those households consist of couples who are legally married. So what this points to is a really rapid uptake of this option to become legally married among same-sex couples. So there was clearly a sort of pent-up demand for marriage among people who had same-sex partners, that once the sort of the bars were taken off and the door was opened, Canadian same-sex couples really moved towards marriage in a big way. The increases in the number of same-sex married couples, or rather the increase in the percentages, the absolute numbers are still pretty small, of same-sex married couples is much greater over these census years than the percentage increases in heterosexual married couples. Now, the way to look at it is this is the percentage of all same-sex couples who are legally married by the census years. 2001, obviously 0%, 17% in 2006, and by the time 10 years later, that has actually doubled, and more than a third of same-sex couples counted by the census are in fact legally married. When we compare Canada to other countries that have legalized same-sex marriage, we see, for whatever reason, a much more rapid uptake, much more of a sort of an appetite for legal marriage among same-sex couples in Canada compared to elsewhere. Few random yet interesting bits of information about, sorry about that, same-sex couples in Canada, now that there's this category that they can take on as husbands or wives. About 1% of all couples in Canada consist of either two men or two women. There's a slight skew towards women, towards female couples. It's only a couple of percentage points. It's not really major. They are geographically quite concentrated, almost half in what's known as the TMV, which is Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. And there's another pretty substantial kind of concentration in the Ottawa area, But outside of those areas, um, especially in the Maritimes and in the prairies, and especially in small towns and rural areas, there aren't a whole lot of married same-sex couples. So it's very geographically concentrated and very urban. It's a generational thing. You find proportionally a lot more younger people. And it is same-sex marriage usually does not involve kids being present. About 12% of same-sex couples co-reside with children under 18, compared with slightly over half of man-woman heterosexual couples. And within this 12%, it's mainly female couples for a couple of reasons. One is biology. A couple with two women have more options or more possibilities for giving birth biologically to children and acquiring children that way. And the other is more sociological, which is that women who who join together and form a couple and form a household, if they've been in prior relationships that had children, say they'd been married to or in a partnership with a male partner before, women at the dissolution of that earlier partnership, women are more likely than men to stay, to have the child living with them. So a good chunk of the children in same-sex married couples are children that the members of the couple, particularly female couples, have brought with them from previous relationships. So there's a gender skew there in terms of where the kids are in same-sex couples. Okay, now I want to talk about an even more recent phenomenon, which is the emergence of asexuality, defined as being a person who does not experience sexual desire, doesn't want to have sex with men, doesn't want to have sex with women, doesn't want to have sex with people who are non-binary, just doesn't want to. The emergence of that as a form of sexual identity rather than a lack or an absence or a pathology of some kind. So the emergence of asexuality is as an identity category that people can uh, opt for. They can see and say, okay, that's me. That's a name, that's a sort of a self that's available to me. Um, the emergence of asexuality is part of the sort of broader proliferation of sexual identities which are available for people to claim, uh, driven in large part by the internet. So I'm going to talk about asexuality, but you've also got pansexuality, allosexuality, demi-romantic gray sexuality. It just, every 6 months you see more and more. The binary is not just broken; it's splintered into dozens, maybe hundreds of forms of identity that were not available as socially, collectively produced terms of discourse a generation ago or even 20 years ago. So we'll look at the rise of asexuality. People who did not experience sexual desire or interest have always existed, but historically, particularly in the global north, have been typically understood as either people who have renounced or sacrificed something, like people who choose to be celibate out of religious convictions or as a form of self-sacrifice, or people who may have something medically or psychologically wrong with them. One of the earliest examples of someone who asexuality as an identity wasn't there to claim in the late 19th century, but someone who understood asexuality as being something which you are. It's a form of a self rather than something which you do or don't do. I discovered the early psychologist Emma Trost. Don't bother with the German. Essentially, she's probably the first person to write about asexuality as other than a problem to be fixed or an act of self-sacrifice and renunciation that's kind of beyond what ordinary people could aspire to, like a nun or a monk. And she argued that excuse me, she described herself, she wrote about herself as what she called a contrary sexual. And she acknowledged, and I just love the way this is framed, the author has the courage to admit to this category. So one of the first people to kind of claim, in her words, a contrary sexuality and to say, yes, this is not just something I do or don't do. This is me. This is who I am. In second wave feminism of the 60s and 70s, asexuality as an idea kind of floated around with and there it had a strong kind of political component to it. The idea was that by being asexual, by not taking part in the social organization of sexual desire, by not being influenced or driven by everything associated with sexuality, it was a way of resisting the pressures to, in air quotes, be normal, fit in, conform to both a patriarchal and a sexist society, and also a capitalist one as well. When you think of how much consumption and sort of material commodification is driven by or is implicated with this idea that, oh, if you do this will kind of be, enhance your sex life in some way. So you had people understanding asexuality as a way of living that actually had strong political implications and not just pathological ones. What's wrong with this person that they're not having sex? So there is that a thread of a political history to asexuality, but asexuality as an identity as we know it today is really driven by the internet. And when I was looking around for some sort of genealogies of asexuality as an identity, much of it comes back to this originally from 1997, early days of the World Wide Web, an essay by a person called Zoe O'Reilly, who made the clear and explicit comparison of asexuals to other, were termed at the time sexual minorities, which were asserting themselves, claiming sort of social space, picking up or creating cultural symbols and so forth. So O'Reilly writes, she uses the terminology of coming out and of pride. I'm out and proud to be asexual. My people are a definite minority group, wish to be recognized like all others. We want a colored ribbon, a national holiday, coupons for fast food, and so forth. So the analogy between asexuality as an identity and being lesbian, gay, bisexual, and so forth as an identity gets made here. And the present day asexuality movement, fueled by the opportunities provided by the internet for people to meet and share ideas, for people to kind of recognize, oh, okay, there's a word for what I am. That's it. The contemporary asexuality movement, identity movement, sort of takes off from there. A little bit of a timeline. the first civil rights legislation in New York City, which prohibited discriminating against people based on their sexual orientation and including asexuality as a form of sexual orientation, along with homosexuality and bisexuality, emerges in a sort of municipal ordinance in New York City in 2002. 2005, you have the first asexual participation in, or 2009, sorry, in what was called Gay Pride. Then the gay kind of gets dropped, and Pride sort of turns into a kind of um, sexual multiplicity celebration. Asexuals first turn up there in 2009. Somebody creates a black, gray, white, and purple asexual flag to go along with the other pride flags in 2010. 2013, this is a kind of a win for asexuality activists. The DSM-5, which some of you may be familiar with, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's kind of like the big book for psychologists for uh, diagnosing and categorizing mental health issues. They had the DSM contains something called hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which basically meant this person doesn't want to have sex. And there was a lot of sort of a battle around leaving that in the DSM or taking it out. And the decision was that it remains in the DSM, but there's a rider, there's a caveat acknowledging that this is not necessarily a disorder for many people. Hypoactive sexual desire, low or absent sexual desire is only a disorder if it is causing distress and dysfunction to an individual. And so there's a caveat saying for people who identify as asexual, this does not apply. First asexual dating site emerges in 2015, and apparently the person who set it up and started running it, the demand was so great that they couldn't keep up and had to close it like a year later. So asexuality as a collective identity was obviously gathering steam. And I understand that in 2020, when everything had to go virtual, asexual pride as a separate entity, not just as kind of a subcategory of like big pride, but as its own separate celebration, set of festivities, happened online in 2020 as asexuals kind of started to break out of the broad pride umbrella. So, like I said, asexuality is only one among a number of sexual identities which proliferate, which are available for individuals to claim or for individuals to learn about and kind of recognize themselves. Like, oh yeah, this is me. This is the identity that I can claim for myself. It's in terms of the history of sexuality, I think this is a really unprecedented moment. This kind of um, uh, proliferation of categories beyond just two or three, and it's going to be fascinating to see where we are in 10 years in terms of the identity categories that exist for people to take up and say, yep, this is me, this is who I am. So that's it for this week, and I will see you all next week.